Time to continue with Velikovsky. We're going to continue to read Worlds in Collision, and we're going to continue to go over the Venus section. Now, the other videos, we've all led up to a point to where Venus is passing right by Earth at this point in time. And it is causing absolute crazy, insane havoc on the entire planet. And this ranges from all kinds of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes. We have land masses sinking below the ocean, and we have land masses being raised above the ocean, right? We have all this kind of insanity going on. So this next section we're going to cover is going to start talking about the oceans and the water and the effects that Venus had on all of that. This next section is called the tides. The ocean tides are produced by the action of the sun and to a larger extent by that of the moon. A body larger than the moon or one nearer to the Earth would act with a greater effect. A comet with a head as large as the Earth passing sufficiently close would raise the waters of the oceans miles high. The slowing down or stasis of the Earth in its rotation would cause a tidal recession of water toward the poles, but the celestial body nearby would disturb this poleward recession, drawing the water towards itself. So basically think of it as if Venus is flying by, think of it like the moon right now. So right now, tidal theory has it to where the moon essentially creates a bulge on one side of the planet, and of course the gravitational effects of the sun create the bulge on the other side. And then you also have centrifugal force adding to that bulge. Now, tidal theory is still just a theory, interestingly enough. It is to be noted that we actually do not have a 100% understanding of why the Earth currently suffers tides. Now, the reason why that's going to be relative here is because the way Velikovsky is going to understand this is that Venus is basically going to act as a much larger moon, right? So if the moon is pulling water towards it as it goes around the Earth, you get your tides, etc. That's the basic of the theory. So now if you have a body the size of Earth coming close, now you're going to have an ultra tide. That bulge that we currently suffer at our equator, if you have Venus flying by, well, now it's miles high. So that's what's going on here. And actually, we need to talk about tidal theory later, because that's a whole interesting subject in and of itself. And interestingly enough, even further, is that the electric universe may actually play into some of the maybe more weirder ideas about, okay, you know what, we're just going to go on. We'll talk about that later. The traditions of many peoples persist that seas were torn apart and their water heaped high and thrown upon the continents. In order to establish that these traditions refer to one and the same event, or at least to an event of the same order, we must keep to this guiding sequence. The great tide followed a disturbance in the motion of the Earth. The Chinese annals, which I have mentioned and which I intend to quote more extensively in a subsequent section, say that in the time of Emperor Yahoo, the sun did not go down for 10 days. The world was in flames, and their vast extent, the waters overtopped the great heights, threatening the heavens with their floods. The water of the ocean was heaped up and cast upon the continent of Asia. A great tidal wave swept over the mountains and broke in the middle of the Chinese Empire. The water was caught in the valleys between the mountains, and the land was flooded for decades. The traditions of the people of Peru tell that for a period of time equal to 5 days and 5 nights, the sun was not in the sky, and then the ocean left the shore and with a terrible din broke over the continent. The entire surface of the earth was changed in this catastrophe. The Choctaw Indians of Oklahoma relate, the earth was plunged in darkness for a very long time. Finally, a bright light appeared in the north, but it was mountain-high waves rapidly coming nearer. In these traditions, there are two concurrent elements. a complete darkness that endured a number of days, in Asia prolonged day, and, when the light broke through, a mountain-high wave that brought destruction. The Hebrew story of the passage of the sea contains the same elements. There was a prolonged and complete darkness, Exodus 10:21. The last day of the darkness was at the Red Sea. When the world plunged out of darkness, the bottom of the sea was uncovered. The waters were driven apart and heaped up like walls in a double tide. The Septuagint translation of the Bible says that the water stood as a wall, and the Quran, referring to this event, says, like mountain. In the old rabbinical literature, it is said that the water was suspended as if it were glass, solid and massive. Could you imagine that? So basically what these people saw, it's not a tsunami situation. This is not a tidal wave. What these people are seeing is basically just a mountain of water slowly being dragged across the continent. Because remember, Venus is electrically connected to the planet Earth at this point. It's grabbing that water right now. So what's going on is it's just heaped up. And so it's not traveling at some insane speed like you would see a tidal wave or something. I'm not saying that the water actually didn't go fast. It was probably pretty quick. But there was areas of the planet that the people literally just saw a mountain of water essentially standing still, like right in front of them, or miles out in front of them. And they weren't, I mean, it wasn't coming towards them. It was just slowly moving in one direction. You know, and it's just, could you imagine that, dude? Just this mountain of water just flowing slowly across the land. Absolutely insane, but 100% scientifically possible. All right, let's go on. The commentator Rashi, guided by the grammatical structure of the sentence in the book of Exodus, explained in accordance with Mechitilla, the water of all oceans and seas was divided. The Midrashim contain the following description. The waters were piled up to the height of 1,600 miles, and they could be seen by all the nations of the earth. The figure in this sentence intends to say that the heap of water was tremendous. According to the scriptures, the waters climbed the mountains and stood above them, and they mounted to the heavens. So that's another thing to think about. So if you ever look back at some sort of a flood situation and people are talking about a literal mountain of water, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about a tsunami, right? They're not talking about a tidal wave. You don't call a tidal wave a mountain high, wall of water that touched the heavens. You don't describe it like that because it doesn't go that high, right? There's no tidal wave 2 miles high that anybody talks about. It's a completely different situation. So don't forget that when you're reading these old texts. There are, well, don't forget that, but also there are so many different kinds of floods. There's a few different kinds of floods that happen in our historical past that our ancestors experienced. It's very important to remember and keep an eye out for key terms that these people are talking about. So if you see them talking about a mountain of water, they're not talking about a standard tidal wave. There are problems with tidal waves in other areas of other parts of history and stuff, right? I'm not saying that stuff doesn't happen. Of course it happens. But those are not to be confused with a literal mountain of water because they're describing it exactly as they saw it. So don't forget that when you guys are doing your history studies. All right, moving on. A sea rent apart was a marvelous spectacle, and it could not have been forgotten. It is mentioned in numerous passages in the scriptures. The pillars of heaven tremble. He divideth the sea with his power. Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through. And he made the waters to stand as a heap. He gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. Then the great sea, the Mediterranean, broke into the Red Sea in an enormous tidal wave. It was an unusual event, and because it was unusual, it became the most impressive recollection in the very long history of this people. All peoples and nations were blasted by the same fire and shattered in the same fury. The tribes of Israel on the shore of a sea found in this annihilation their salvation from bondage. They escaped destruction, but their oppressors perished before their eyes. They extolled the Creator, took upon themselves the burden of moral rules, and considered themselves chosen for a great destiny. And okay, so for some weird reason out of all of this, the Jewish people thought that this is what made them God's chosen people. I don't know why. That's the religious side of stuff. But please don't forget that Velikovsky is not blaming any of this stuff on God. So for you atheists out there who take offense to this stuff pretty quickly or throw up your defenses, don't do that. Just keep rolling with it. Velikovsky approaches things scientifically. I just want to throw that out there because I feel like atheists just absolutely lose their mind when a person who holds a religious faith starts to talk about science. These people, if you're an atheist and you don't listen to the religious scientists, I promise you are missing out on all kinds of amazing, true scientific information. All right, let's keep going. When the Spaniards conquered Yucatan, Indians versed in their ancient literature related to the conquerors the traditions passed down to them by their ancestors. Their forefathers were delivered from pursuit by some other people when the Lord opened for them a way in the midst of the ocean. This tradition is so similar to the Jewish tradition of the passage that some of the friars who came to America believed that the Indians of America were of Jewish origin. Friar Diego de Landa wrote, "Some old men of Yucatan say that they have heard from their ancestors that this country was peopled by a certain race who came from the east, whom God delivered by opening for them 12 roads through the sea. If this is true, all the inhabitants of the Indies must be of Jewish descent." Now that's crazy. Now this is one of the countless times to where we find ancient cultures all across the planet having exactly either identical stories or extraordinarily similar stories from those people on the other side of the planet. And this is what's ignored by the mainstream. Like, why would you ignore this? This is their history. This is the Yucatan's history. And mainstream, they just ignore it. It's nothing. Don't worry about it. Religious people, they ignore it too, actually. I don't see a lot of scholarship on that. Or any scholarship that makes, like, you know, high levels of noise. So, anyway, alright, let's keep going. It may have been an echo of what happened at the Sea of Passage, or a description of a similar occurrence at the same time, but in another place. According to the Lapland cosmogonic story, when the wickedness increased among the human beings, the midmost of earth trembled with terror, so that the upper layers of the earth fell away, and many of the people were hurled into these caved-in places to perish. And Jubmel, the heaven lord himself, came down. His terrible anger flashed like red, blue, and green fire serpents. And people hid their faces, and the children screamed with fear. The angry God spoke. "I shall reverse the world. I shall bid the rivers flow upward. I shall cause the sea to gather itself up into a huge, towering wall, which I shall hurl upon your wicked earth children, and thus destroy them and all life."
Jubmel set a storm wind blowing, and the wild air spirits raging. Foaming, dashing, rising sky high, came the seawall, crushing all things. Jubmel, with one strong upheaval, made the earthlands all turn over. Then the world again he righted. Now the mountains and the highlands could no more be seen by the sun. Filled with groans of dying people was the fair earth, home of mankind. No more sun shone in the heaven.
According to the Lapland epic, the world was overwhelmed by the hurricane and the sea, and almost all human beings perished. After the sea wall fell on the continent, gigantic waves continued to roll, and dead bodies were dashed about in dark waters. The great earthquake and the chasms that opened in the ground, the appearance of a celestial body with serpent-like flashes, rivers flowing upward, a sea wall that crushed everything, mountains that became leveled or covered with water, the world that was turned over and then righted, the sun that no more shone in the sky. All these are motifs which we found in the description of the calamities of the time of the Exodus. So this is the crazy stuff that's happening here that everybody talks about across the planet. The fact that it all lines up, this should have been a wake-up call to every single historian, archaeologist, scientist, I don't care. Every bit of studies on this planet should have been slapped around by this, and all attention literally should have been diverted to trying to figure out why all of our ancient ancestors have these crazy stories. Why do they all talk about this? Alright, but that didn't happen. It blows me away. It blows me away that like our ancestors are telling us what happened. This is what happened, you guys. The freaking planet flipped over. They tell us that. They say the Earth flipped over. These people are well aware that we live on a planet, first of all. Alright, these are our ancient ancestors. These people who mainstream make out as monkeys. Right? Not monkeys. These people are well aware of Earth, and they are well aware of what happened to them when they flipped over, and the catastrophes that followed with that, and they all report it. And of course, the geology shows it too, but we got to ignore that as well, right, geologists? All right, keep going. In many places of the world, and especially in the north, large boulders are found in a position which proves that a great force must have lifted them up and carried them long distances before depositing them where they are found today. Sometimes these large, loose rocks are of entirely different mineral composition than the local rocks, but are akin to formations many miles away. Thus, occasionally an erratic boulder of granite perches on top of a high ridge of dolerite, whereas the nearest outcrops of granite lie far away. These erratic boulders may weigh as much as 10,000 tons, about as much as 130,000 people. He's referencing erratic boulders out there, right? And the erratic boulders mainstream attributes to the Ice Age, which is a ridiculous concept, but that's all they have to explain that. Let's see what Velikovsky has to say. To explain these facts, the scholars of the first half of the 19th century assumed that enormous tides had swept over the continents and carried with them masses of stone. Very interesting. The transfer of the rocks was explained by the tides. But what could have caused these billows to rise high over the continents? It was conceived that somehow and somewhere in the far north, a series of gigantic waves was mysteriously propagated. These waves were supposed to have precipitated themselves upon the land, and then swept madly on over mountain and valley alike, carrying along with them a mighty burden of rocks and stones and rubbish. Such deluges were styled waves of translation, and the till was believed to represent the materials which they hurried along with them in their wild course across the country. As a side note, the till is a very peculiar layer in geology. I'll actually have to do a whole show on that. But anyways, just so you guys know, the till, it's a layer in geology. Geologic layer, whatever. The stones and boulders on the hilltops and the mounds of sand and gravel in the lowlands were explained by this theory. It's interesting, see, even back then, before the Ice Age really took off, people, they were already on to the correct explanation. And we see that all throughout history back in the 1700s and the 1800s. I mean, they're already there. You know, I've done another show on a whole scientific article that shows proof that all of Europe was dropped 1,000 feet into the ocean, essentially, or risen 1,000 feet up. Either way, it had 1,000 feet of some sort of a wave crash into it. And there's proof. The geology is there. There's nothing you can argue with it, right? So these people are already on the right track. Imagine had we stayed with the real science. Imagine where we would be today. Man, sucks we're so far behind now. Alright. Critics, however, maintained that it was unfortunate for this view that it violated at the very outset the first principles of science, by assuming the former existence of a cause which there was little in nature to warrant. Spasmodic rushes of the sea across the whole country had fortunately never been experienced within the memory of man. That correctness of the last sentence is questionable is shown by references to the traditions of a number of people. And now we know, especially, nowadays we've seen tsunamis. Like now we have that memory of man. We have it on video. We can literally watch oceans now overtake entire parts of countries. So back then they didn't understand any of that, right? It wasn't happening, right? People were not, at this period of time anyway, tsunamis were not an issue. Nobody in America or Europe were being inundated with huge tsunamis. It just wasn't happening. And because it wasn't happening, these people were arguing essentially that it couldn't be real. The whole problem with all of this catastrophism stuff is that mainstream science basically says, well, if it's not happening right now, that means it never could have happened in the past. It's the dumbest standpoint you could ever imagine having, and mainstream science has it. It's ridiculous. Okay. Wherever possible, the movement of stones was attributed to the progress of the ice sheet in the glacial ages, and to glaciers on mountain slopes. Yeah. Some guy named Agassiz in 1840 assumed that just as the alpine moraines were left behind by the retreating glaciers, so the moraines in the flatlands of northern Europe and America could have been caused by the same movement of great continental ice sheets, and thus introduced the theory of ice ages. And this is what just absolutely has set back history just ungodly amounts of steps. Ugh. Although this is correct to some extent, the analogy is not exact, as the glaciers of the Alps push the stones down, not up the slope, right? You don't do that. Glaciers don't do that. They go down. Meeting an upward motion of the ice, large boulders would probably sink into the ice. Correct. The problem of the migration of the stones must be regarded as only partially connected to the progress and retreat of an ice sheet, if at all. Billows miles high traveled over the land, originating in causes described in this book. It can be established by the extent of denudation of the rocks under the erratic boulders that the latter were deposited at their places during human history. So, for instance, in Wales and Yorkshire, where this effect was evaluated in terms of time, the amount of denudation of limestone rocks on which boulders lie is a proof that a period of no more than 6,000 years has elapsed since the boulders were left in their positions. The fact that accumulations of stone were transferred from the equator toward the higher latitudes, an enigmatic problem in the ice theory, yeah, that's a small problem, can be explained by the poleward recession of the equatorial waters at the moment the velocity of rotation of the Earth was reduced, or its poles were shifted. In the northern hemisphere in India, the moraines were carried from the equator not only to higher latitudes, but also toward the Himalaya mountains. And in the southern hemisphere, from the equatorial regions of Africa towards the higher latitudes, across the prairies and deserts and forests of the Black Continent. And that's the end of this section. So here we have Velikovsky talking about the repercussions of the planet if it were to have been turned over, physically turned over. And I know that may initially sound crazy, and I definitely have more questions regarding this. But if the planet was flipped over to where we have, once again, tons of culture saying that at some point in time, the sun used to rise in the west and set in the east. And it happened a couple of times. All right, we'll get into some of that stuff later. But you have these recordings. So if something like that was going on, that means the after effects are going to be insane. I mean, you're going to have insane amounts of water problems, right? And this is how you get it. You do not need an ice age to explain erratic boulders. You do not need an ice age to explain why you see all the certain kind of scratch marks, etc., that they find on rocks that they try to blame on glaciers rolling across the land. And then at the very end, Velikovsky really nails it, because one of the problems about the ice sheet theory is that the mainstream literally says, because they have to if they follow the markings, they say that somehow the ice age expanded out from the equator on Earth to the northern and southern latitudes. Explain that one. So basically what they're saying is, I mean, at that point, that would mean the entire equator area is frozen. I have no idea how tropical animals survive. And then the glaciers, they fan out in that direction in one of their ice age theories. It's ridiculous. Right? We don't need any of that stuff. We can just use what our ancestors said, and then we can incorporate plasma cosmology, and then we can put it all together. All right, that's it for this. It's long enough. We'll keep going with the next chapter in the next show.